Hello and welcome to Her Next Step, the podcast where women in the public service talk about how their passion and their intuition led them to interesting and exciting career paths. We'll hear about the fears and challenges that could have held them back and about the internal and external supports that enabled them to take their next step. I'm Lily Murphy and I'm speaking to women whose stories will, I believe, inspire you to wonder what stepping stones would help you to take your next step. In this episode of Her Next Step, AnnDoherty, CEO of Cork City Council, tackles the difference between management and leadership. She talks about how you're only as good as your team and how you can earn support through respect, honesty, and communication. Let me know if you're enjoying the show. What's fascinating for me about Anne and her career is that Anne started life as a nurse. And, a previous interviewee on Her Next Step, Edel McSharry, said once that when nurses are trained, they have absolutely no idea of what they're capable of, but actually they're capable of running the world. And here we have somebody who I believe is a clear demonstration of that fact. You're most welcome, Anne, and we're delighted to have you here at Her Next Step.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for having me.
I would really love to know, to start, what's the achievement you're most proud of in your career?
In my career, gosh, I suppose I've been really lucky that I've had the opportunity to do absolutely amazing things. So it's hard to kind of pick one over another. I suppose training as a nurse is something that I'm really, really proud of because, as you mentioned in your introduction, uh, once you've trained as a nurse, actually, it's skills that you can take anywhere and apply to anything. I suppose then after that, I suppose most recently becoming the chief executive of Cork City Council has been something I'm really proud of because I'd worked in the health service for over 30 years and we do tend to sometimes pigeonhole people into sectors. So being able to bring all that skills and learning into a new place has been something that I'm really, really proud of.
So let's go back then to, when you were in national school and
Mhm.
if I had stood in front of your peer group at that stage and said, somebody in this classroom will end up as the CEO of Cork City Council, would they have assumed that might be Anne?
I don't think so. But maybe I don't think so. And AnnDoherty definitely wouldn't have thought about it. I suppose like lots of little girls when I was very small, I wanted to be a teacher. I suppose that was the first role model outside of the home that we all as kids, especially as girls, see was teacher. You know, lots of our teachers were females when we were small. I can remember, having an array of objects that I used to teach when I'd come home from school every evening as you do as a little
Yes.
girl. And then as when I went to secondary school, I suppose I did at one stage kind of have aspirations maybe of being a doctor. But again, maybe that was influenced by things that are around you or things that you see. But when I was about 14, I probably settled down that I wanted to be a nurse. Influenced a lot at the time because my grandmother had a stroke and she lived with us, had lots of care needs. So I suppose kind of got a bit involved in that. And then I suppose it's history then applied for nursing when I did my leaving cert, applied all over Ireland and was offered a place at the then Cork Regional Hospital, which is now Cork University Hospital, which was way, 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 way back in the early 80s.
And I'm just wondering, Anne, so just in terms of ambition and, even the desire to go out to some sort of job, be a doctor, be a teacher, be a nurse, do you feel that ambition was nurtured at home as when you were growing up?
Yes, I do think so. Like my dad died when I was 14, so there was only my mom and myself. My mom was a very not ambitious lady. She was a very hardworking lady. She was very capable. Didn't have the benefit maybe of formal education in the way that I had, but definitely leaving school early was not an option. You know, doing your leaving cert was on the menu, and definitely encouraged to go on and do something else. Was it nurtured? Yes. But it probably wasn't talked about. You know, it wasn't a conversation every night at dinner, what are you going to do? It was just kind of, you get
Mm.
on with the world. And I worked in a part-time job from when I was 14. I've sold paint and nails and wallpaper and wallpaper crystal and retail's great old grounding for everybody, I think, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Something maybe everybody should have a little trip through, because it is very much around, obviously there's an economic learning, but there's a massive customer care learning as well. As I said, we didn't sit around every night going, oh my God, blue skies, what are you going to do? Very much encouraged to do what you could and what you were capable of doing, but never restricted either.
Mm.
Never forced to go one way or another way.
And did you ever look back and think, actually, maybe I should have done medicine?
There are some days I probably do, but I think everybody has this really romantic notion of maybe George Clooney and ER, was it? And then the day, was that what influenced people about wanting to do medicine? But interestingly, my middle child is a doctor. So
Okay.
yeah, so it's hard, and I admire anyone who does medicine. But
Mm.
I suppose I kind of hope I've contributed to the health and well-being of people in all of the roles that I've had. So maybe if I'd done medicine, maybe I wouldn't be here today, or maybe I would. Sure, we don't know. We can't
Yeah,
draw the
yeah.
parallel.
Perhaps the opportunities might have been more limited in some ways.
Maybe, yeah, yeah.
So nursing then in Cork, did you love it?
Loved it, but sure, we were the innocent abroad when you think of it. Like we were, what, 18, 19, we were moved away from home, we were apprenticed, if you think
Yes.
about it. There used to be a joke, see one, do one, teach one, but actually it was far more serious than that. We did an amazing education in our nursing school. It wasn't university based, but we were at the same standard as, the first year med students in terms of pharmacology, anatomy. We had a really, really good education. Obviously, the nuns were very involved in our education and our clinical practice. The matron of the hospital was one of the sisters' theatre. So I suppose there was a very strong ethos that came from that training. Vocational, I suppose you could argue, was kind of, there was that thing that it was a vocation to become a nurse.
And we were paid.
We were paid, and twice a month. I mean, we had lots of fun as well. Like, it was very serious what we did, and we worked really hard, but we played as well. We had great fun. And interestingly, the group I trained with are having a reunion, 40 years in April. It's going to be quite amazing to see people, some you mightn't have seen in nearly 40 years.
Goodness. Yeah, it'll be
Mm.
interesting to see how many of them stayed in nursing and how many of them, like yourself,
Yeah, yeah.
have diversified. And you completed your training, and then what did you next? What was your next step?
So when we qualified way, way back in 1987, Ireland was not in the best of place from an economic perspective. We were the first group not to get any what was called staffing at the time, which was the 6 months post-qualifying experience. So at the time, a lot of the London hospitals were in Ireland recruiting, and a large number of us ended up in King's College Hospital Group in South London.
I'm sure that was chasing both fun and career and money and God only knows what else.
Yeah, yeah, it was interesting. I ended up in Dulwich Hospital, which was about 3 or 4 miles away from King's main campus, working in an elective orthopedic ward. But it was another world. I was living in East Dulwich. The main campus was in Camberwell, and Brixton was just distant from it, and it was just a little after the Brixton riots. So it was an interesting time in that part of London. I suppose as a young farmer's daughter who'd come to Cork to be a student, suddenly landed in a very multicultural environment, which I wouldn't have had experience in
Mm.
the way that I was immersed into, working with people from lots of different nationalities all over the world. That was definitely a learning experience.
Mm.
So, for example, I used to say, "Oh, something's in the press," and now in my house, everything's in a cupboard,
Mm.
because the press was something you did your trousers in,
Yeah.
for example. So, there's a few things that one had to adjust to quite
Mm.
quickly. But London is an amazing place, but was even back then. So my now husband, who I met when I was a student, we settled in Southeast London. I worked, as I said, at King's, then over to the main campus, working in clinical services, and then managing clinical services, and then getting more involved in general management. Jim had his own business. He was He had been a carpenter here in Ireland at the time, so he had his own business. So we were busy little bees, and we had
Mm.
our two gorgeous sons while we were there. And but the old lull of Ireland always calls you home.
But I'm curious then, so you went from frontline nursing, say, into management.
Mm.
Was that kind of part of who you are, being a manager, or how did that come about that you?
I think when you train to be a nurse, you automatically actually learn a lot of skills about managing yourself, managing your caseload, managing other people, because everything you do is actually very strongly management orientated, as you know. Um, so I didn't have any desire, I suppose, to be a manager, but it kind of all happened. So,
Mm,
like you're in charge of a ward
yeah.
when you're on as a staff nurse or
Even
at
as a
night,
student.
and even as a student,
Mm,
that can happen. And then when I went to London, as I said, there were no jobs in Ireland, and then in London you couldn't get staff. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Those
yeah.
economic cycles. And about a year after we went, this ward I was on, I was suddenly the most senior person. So 1 year qualified. So I ended up as an acting ward sister. Like when I look back in it, it was
Yeah.
bit bonkers. But anyway, so there was a bit about having to learning fast, and then I was doing that for a while, and they advertised the job, and they didn't appoint anybody. I hadn't obviously applied because I suppose coming from the Irish system, you'd have to be fairly senior to apply for such a responsible role. But anyway, as it happened, was doing it a while, was going well, and they advertised again, and I applied, and I was successful. So that was kind of probably the first formal step into the old management arena.
Mm. Yeah, I think that does happen in the UK much more, that people are kind of,
Hmm.
much quicker moving forward and moving up in the ladder somewhat. What did you learn at that point about management and, I suppose, managing people as well as managing a workload that has stood to you?
I think when you're in a management role, and I suppose then we'll probably talk about the difference between management and leadership, but actually they're probably quite intertwinable. It is all about people. It is about how you bring your team with you, how you include them, how you support them to be good practitioners in that environment in their own right, but also be there to give them guidance. So it's kind of that, almost it's a little bit of pull and push, I
Mm,
think always. So very much about creating the conditions for people to thrive in, be really strong in communication, but recognizing the strengths and weaknesses in the team as well, and how you bring that out and try and ensure that they share those skills with each other.
mm,
That would be, I suppose, some of the strong learnings I think that I would have had and would have had to learn very. And you have to, like as a manager, you rely on your team. You're only as good as your team.
mm,
So I suppose because I was so young, both in age and experience, I really did have to rely on my team. But I had and it's having their support. But that's back then to how you treat people, where respect and honesty features. And then, you have to sometimes make some really hard decisions. So
mm.
it's about being able to communicate them as well.
I suppose, Anne, I'm just curious then, what would you say to a young one who's offered the opportunity to go into management, and who feels they don't have the experience yet, and who feels maybe, there's an older group of people there who know more than they do, and, who may not be amenable to having a young one stepping up into that role? What would you say?
My mother always had a saying that an ounce of breeding is better than a ton of feeding. So
Mm,
some people have ability, or aptitude maybe is a better word. Some people have an aptitude to be really good at something, and other people don't have the same aptitude. So if you feel you have an aptitude and you're willing to learn, go for it. But always admit what you don't know. There's no weakness in saying,
mm,
I don't know that or I don't understand that. I don't see that as a weakness. I see
mm,
that as strength. Pretending you know everything is actually far more dangerous. So
absolutely.
if you have, you need to be interested in what you do. You have to get out of bed every day and really want to do what you do. So if you're interested, you have aptitude, and you've got that attitude, I would say go for it. Sure, what could possibly go wrong?
quite a lot sometimes. But
Sometimes, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
but even if it
yeah.
does go wrong, at least,
Well, yeah,
you've
but you have
learned
to
something,
admit,
haven't you?
yeah, but
Mm,
you have to admit that.
mm.
And sometimes fish isn't there, and you have to call that as well. So it's often braver to try something and admit that the fish isn't there than to sit and not try it. Because you have to
And
push yourself.
and complain about the person who did
And
take the
person who's
job.
there,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So, Anne, you said that you had a strong pull to home at that point in your career.
Yeah, well, I suppose it was more family than career, definitely. I'd been so lucky working in the NHS. I had a fabulous job. I was well educated. I did an MBA, which was supported by my employer at the time. I was working in a really exciting environment. Purchaser provider split had come in. I was working on the provider side, doing contracting, strategy. Really, really interesting stuff.
Okay, so actually, before we talk about moving home, then that seems like a big move from being what I presume was the ward sister to moving into more strategizing role.
Yeah, so as was I ended up as a ward sister probably by accident, if that's the right way to describe it. Then ended up managing, a whole unit, multiple wards, outpatient theatres, and then moved into working in actually infection control for a couple of years, which was really, really interesting because you're from the morgue to the ICU to the kitchen to everywhere, and then got involved in more general management, working on transformational projects, but also service contracting and strategy development, which was part of kind of that whole purchaser provider environment in the NHS at the time.
What really strikes me, Anne, is how easily you say I moved from that into this into managing such an enormous portfolio, if you like.
Hmm.
And that doesn't just happen. You don't just move into something that's bigger and bigger. So, what was going on that enabled you to keep increasing your leadership, your influence?
Yeah, I suppose it's a combination of things, Lily. So education was one. So I was very fortunate to get supported to study an MBA. That was back in 1995 when MBAs, I suppose, were rare and definitely nurses didn't do them
Mm,
at the time. I also worked with some great mentors who probably hopefully saw some potential and gave me great opportunity. So along the way, the people you meet are really important
absolutely.
because if you get opportunity or the mentoring that you can get, and I don't mean formal mentoring now, I mean the working side by side or with, and I was always interested in doing different things. So if somebody was saying, "Oh, there's a project on X," sure, I'd say, "Oh, we'll give it that an old flash, see where we end up in terms of, outside of maybe your day-to-day job." And so I think if you're open to doing and taking on new things, then you will get
Mm,
opportunities. And at that time in London, I suppose there was a huge amount of change going on, especially we were in a Thatcher era, it was purchaser provider, it was very much a business model in healthcare. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I think there were good bits and there weren't such good bits sometimes as well.
mm.
So that's how all those kind of opportunities happened.
As well as saying, putting yourself forward for taking leadership on various projects, did you have to compete for jobs and put
Oh
yourself
God.
forward for interviewing?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah, but I suppose you wouldn't have done that if you didn't have some of the opportunities that you had to be able to
Mm,
put yourself forward. And I suppose the environment there was kind of different to here. You definitely would get encouraged. You would always be encouraged before
mm,
you went to apply for a job to go to the people who were, the managers and the roles, and in that it was a different environment in terms of that you would have a good sense of your fit for a job before you went for it. Whereas when I came back here, because you're not allowed to speak to the people who are even running the service in case it'll be seen as some conflict of something somewhere, which kind
yeah.
of doesn't make a lot of sense to me from a fit perspective. Because in
Mm,
any job, there's a fit
yes, that's
component.
right. Yeah, I suppose just the one thing about what you've just said, Anne, is it really strikes me that women underplay their achievements hugely, just as you've just done, where you said, I ended up in something without kind of identifying, the amount of work, presumably networking, as you said, being willing to take on projects and put yourself out there. So I'm wondering, is that your experience also? Do women undersell themselves and their achievements?
I think that they do, but I think as well that when women have achievements, they're real achievements. I suppose in my experience of people and in my own experience, like I've had to work my socks off to get where I had to get to. Anything I was asked to do, I absolutely threw myself into it, did it to the absolute nth of my life, at probably huge personal cost to my family in the sense of long hours, etc. So anything I talk about, it's because I've done it. There's an authenticity to it. I'm not suggesting that lots of people don't have authenticity, but I think women need they they have to have the security of the authenticity, if that makes any sense,
Mm,
to talk about our achievements because we
okay.
wouldn't bluff it.
It's not the first time I've heard that. And I suppose that sense that, yeah, women do actually need to have proven to themselves that they're capable of doing something before they'll take the next step. And sometimes they may therefore hold themselves back from opportunities where in
Mm.
fact they could thrive.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose, whether we like it or not, there are challenges at trying to be all things to all people, be the best in your workplace, be the best, in my circumstance, try and be the best wife, the best mother, the best daughter. There's a lot going on.
Mm,
And it's how you balance all of that.
mm,
Like, so when my little girl was small, she's my youngest, she's 18, she's doing her leaving cert at the moment. She used to say, when I grow up, mommy, I don't want to work out of the home. So that used really, whoa,
mm.
see, yeah. Whereas now she's changed a little bit. So, you have to, now her daddy, she'd never say that to, yeah. And he probably wouldn't go if she did. But
Yes.
as the mummy, you do have a tendency to think, oh God, did I call this wrong?
Funnily enough, we had a similar conversation with Andrea Feeney, who's the CEO of the State Exams Commission, on a previous episode. And she talked about that balance between, I suppose, following your own ambition and your own, motivations and desire to be fulfilled,
Mm.
and balancing that with a sense of responsibility in other areas of your life.
I'm sure if you speak to people around me, they say, oh, Anne's very ambitious. I don't consider myself very ambitious. I just consider that I've been along this road and we meander along the road and different things happen along the way and you take little side journeys and see what they bring you. Now maybe is that what ambition really is? Maybe it is. But yeah, definitely as I've got older, when I was younger, I'd never phased me, the juggle of this and missing things like you miss school concerts or you're trying to juggle them or you're trying to reorganize your diary to get to a match or whatever. When I was younger, it didn't bother me as much. As I've got older, I've probably not felt guilty but probably questioned more.
Mm,
Have I called this right? But you know what, life isn't about regretting what you did. It should be really about celebrating all
mm,
the good things that you have in your life, be it your family, your work, your friends,
yeah.
whatever makes part of your life.
Mm. And I suppose there's always periods in our life when we stop and reevaluate. And it's okay to kind of have had one set of values and be driven by them for a period of time, and actually to come to a point where you think, maybe those same values aren't as important at this moment in time.
Yeah, yeah, and that doesn't mean you got it right or you got it wrong or you were good or bad or they were right or wrong. So, I think that's just the journey of maybe of not maturity. Yeah, I suppose it is maturity. And then maybe as you get older, you start to think different things are important.
Mm.
Or you've kind of been there and bought the book and you think,
Yeah.
don't need to read that book again.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
So you said the call to home was very strong for you at that point.
Yeah, I suppose, well, we had two little boys. They were 5 and 2. Parents. Jim's dad had died. My mum obviously was still alive, and Jim's mum, Jim has lots of brothers and sisters. So we said, we need to go now or stay forever. So back we came to Cork. I suppose I'd been a student here, but also from Jim's perspective, the type of business he was in, he felt he'd have a better chance of kind of starting up because it was like starting all over again.
Of course.
um, you know, in
Mm,
terms of whatever you had, wherever you were, you had to start again. So when we tried to come home, I applied for jobs on what I call the admin side of the then health boards, and I was advised that I was ineligible to apply because at the time you had to be within the common recruitment pool of public sector, which was local government and health, and so as an outsider, I couldn't get in. So I ended up applying for a job in West Cork in a most amazing place called Mount Carmel Community Hospital and Home as a matron. I got the job. I hadn't worked clinically for years at that stage. A matron in a small hospital like that is jack of all trades. You're the CEO, you're the janitor, you're the head of nursing, you're everything.
mm,
And one of the best things that ever happened to me, probably coming back to Ireland, because Ireland had been through 10 years of really difficult financial times. This was an amazing place of people who were so innovative because at the time, if you remember, lots of hospitals were closed. So I think kind of part of the survival tactic was to keep the head down and they might forget we're here and we can keep going. There had been this gorgeous lady who'd been the matron, a religious sister who had retired, and there was the assistant matron was also the most amazing lady I ever worked with, Sister Philomena, who's since passed away, but she was a force to be reckoned with. But amazing lady, amazing,
mm.
amazing lady, who had to deal with this young one that came back from London with all her notions, quite, but who'd worked in a very different system. But we did some great stuff together. Amazing staff there, who had had nothing for years and years and years. These were in the days now when people had to cut, sanit or incontinence sheets in two. You remember
Yeah.
those days? Yeah.
Yes, I do
Yeah,
remember.
yeah. That was what people had
Mm.
to, try and maintain dignity for their patients just because of the financial situation of the country.
So it required, as you say, not just being clinically proficient, but actually being a business manager, being an innovator.
Yeah, a
Uh,
pharmacist, a stock
mm,
controller. It was a bit of a shock, some of it, but it was brilliant,
mm,
absolutely brilliant. And again, look, it just requires you to be flexible. You absolutely have to recognize the strength of the team. It's back to the communication, bringing people with you, listening, and supporting people to get on and do their job.
mm.
Same skills.
How long did you spend at that role?
I was about 2 years in Clonakilty, and the then CEO had asked me if I would take on a project for the health board, which was developing a strategy for older people, which because I'd worked in the strategy sphere, I suppose it was seen that I had something to bring. So I would have led a project developing a strategy for older people in Cork and Kerry, way, way, way back, which was called Aging with Confidence. Great, great, interesting piece of work. And then from that, I went on to stay more centrally in the health board, eventually getting a job as director of strategy and planning prior to the establishment of the HSE.
Yeah, and that was a time of a lot of change as well, wasn't it, within the
Yeah.
HSE? Yeah.
Oh my gosh, yeah, yeah.
Mm,
I suppose, like all change, big change at the system level like that is really, really challenging at the time. There was a national competition for national director roles, and I was very fortunate, put myself forward in a competition and was appointed as national director. And I would have taken on the role of change management and organisational development at the beginning of this, when the HSE was first established. So setting up all the structures, all that type of stuff, but also, again, I suppose having an interest in the strategic side, trying to take a lead on the corporate planning and performance management type at a corporate level within the HSE. Yeah, they were interesting times.
Mm,
As big organizational change like that, this was the most important thing we all have to remember, that for everybody involved in the change, there is a personal fear or there's a personal delight, or, we have to kind of meet people where they're at. Sometimes I think we forget that with big organizational changes. And, that's how then we end up with people feeling very hurt and very let
mm,
down. And then they become potentially organizational terrorists, as I call them.
yeah.
And we've all probably been a bit of an organizational terrorist at some stage
Mm.
ourselves when we don't like what's going on around us.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, though, Anne, isn't it? That the driver for change may be, improving a service or economic drivers or whatever. But actually, as you say, for it to actually take hold, the people on the ground have to be willing to make changes
Absolutely.
and do things differently and organise their lives differently.
And it's hard to bring everybody on that
Mm,
journey. And I don't know if anyone has cracked it. Maybe it's different, maybe in the private sector. I don't know. I haven't worked in the private sector. But I suppose we all assume that the levers in the private sector are more
mm,
flexible, but maybe they're not. But the levers in, it's very hard sometimes in change in the public sector. If there's genuinely people who want to leave or who just don't want to be part, we've no lever to support people if they want to exit. Um, and that's, I think, often a weakness. So you end up then asking people to do things that they don't believe in, and sure, if you don't
mm,
believe in it, how are you going to lead it? And then look at all the damage you're doing, not deliberately, just by
yeah.
not being, I suppose, totally believing in something. So I do think that a
Mm,
change, it's so personal, and I would, in the public service, we're all totally committed to public sector values. But when it starts to hit maybe people's sense of feeling of value within an organization, that can be challenging.
looking back, that big shift for you, particularly into national a national role and driving national change. What was the biggest change that you feel was worthwhile, or that made this change worthwhile?
It was amazing to be part of the setup of something, very, very different. There were definitely lots of strengths in the existing system, but there was great opportunity seeing it potentially, with this very strong sense of having a strong national policy, with having really enabled and supported local delivery. Now, what happened was maybe a little bit different, but that was maybe the starting point. I suppose for me personally, I probably maybe hadn't thought it all through fully, or neither do any of us. Suddenly I was in Dublin 4 or 5 days a week. 3 months in, I had the honour of getting pregnant. Uh, at 40, and spent the next 3 months looking at my husband going, how did that happen? But anyway, we kind of figured that out, I suppose you'd tell me.
Yes, nurse.
And our children did too. Yeah, they were a bit horrified. Our boys were very horrified at all of that. So suddenly, I was in this national job, staying in hotel rooms in Dublin, pregnant. That was a bit of a soul searching time at times,
Mm,
and probably performance wise, maybe I wasn't as good as I wanted to be or should have been. You start to
mm,
kind of doubt yourself a little bit. But it was really, really, and I've been exposed to that nationals arena. We used to go to the health subcommittee, cabinet subcommittees on health, and sure, like I'd never been near anything like that, before
mm,
Oireachtas committees. So like the experience personally was amazing, but also just understanding how our big system works. I think a lot of
mm.
us, as we work in this, we don't have maybe a full appreciation
Mm,
how all those bits fit together.
yes. And how challenging it is really to make anything happen, and
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
any big change in particular.
But when you work in a service, you're quite myopic about your service, and
Mm,
everybody else is wrong. So it's been really, I suppose, eye opening, especially that time working nationally with the HSE. Just that exposure to,
mm,
the health service is only but one cog in a huge wheel of public service in our country, and we have to compete for resources, but also maybe the potential about what can happen if we work more cross departmentally, and yeah, just some of
Mm,
the joined up public service that everybody talks about. There's great
mm,
potential in that, I think. But it was hard times. Money was a problem, as you know, very,
mm,
very quickly. So HSE was set up in 2005. So by 7, 8, now like things were really, really tough for
yeah.
everybody because there was significant financial challenges. At that stage, I had Michelle, who's obviously a joy to our lives, doing her leave in search at the moment. So that's not a joy for her or us
No.
at the moment, but sure, look, this too will pass. God bless them for children
Yes.
going through that. I hadn't realized it wasn't that bad in our day, was it, Lily? I don't know. It seems
No,
to
I
be
don't think so.
very tough
Mm,
on them now.
mm,
Anyway, so after I went back after I had Michelle, at the time there'd been our then CEO Brendan Drum, Professor Brendan Drum, asked me if I would take over the hospital's office for a couple of months. There was just some changes, so again I said, "Sure, look, here we go. Why not?" You know,
never
um,
one to resist a challenge.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I know. It was such an honour to be asked to
Mm,
do that. So 50 hospitals countrywide, set up a team, some great people that were identified to come and work with me, and I did that for over 2 years, and until we did change in organisational structures internally, which drives everybody mad. But I think when you're setting up something new, you have to be open to tweaking it. But again, I suppose we all respond by saying, "Oh God, what's in this for me?" And there's the bit about, "Oh, is this been changed because I didn't do something?" Or we all get into
mm,
that personal space, don't we, around change again. But
mm,
yeah, hospital's office was interesting. There was a lot of HICWA had come on the scene, having been
mm,
established, really important in terms of, I think, that kind of third party assurance for public. But there was things like there was some challenges around breast services in the Midlands, radiology services in the Northeast, and a few others, which I suppose became very public. So kind of thrown into this accountability piece, never shied away from accountability, but this very public scrutiny of your accountability, if
mm,
that makes any
mm,
sense,
sure.
radio, television, like where was that in the job description?
Yeah. And talking of public scrutiny and accountability, you're in a role currently
Mm.
that absolutely exposes you to both of those. So that was a quick transition, and just tell us, how did that happen? How did you move into a county council leadership role?
So I had been asked by Minister O'Reilly at the time to go to Limerick to set up a hospital group, um, which was the last role I had as National Director in the HSE. And somebody said to me one day, "Have you seen, local authority jobs advertised in Cork?" And I was going, "Yeah, sure, who'd be looking at you from the health service?" Anyway, one submitted an application form, public appointments, and here we are. Needed to get back to Cork, but maybe I was just ready for a change as well. 30 years in the health service, like you've enormous contacts, experience, understanding, but I was probably needing a bit of a change to refresh a little bit
Mm,
on a personal level, but also I suppose I do see such an alignment between the role of the local authority and the whole pursuit of health and well-being for us as citizens, because the health service is that I'd worked in was very much around disease management, acute hospitals, yeah, whereas the role in the local authority takes on every aspect of the determinants of health, which I know everybody goes, "Oh yeah, yeah," but actually it does. And
critical.
so
Mm,
it's critical, where we live, the type of environment we have, how we get about. So that kind of really interested me. So here we are, 10 years later.
are you 10 years in this role?
hmm 10
Wow.
years in September. So my contract's up in September. It's a 10-year, well, sorry, 7-year contract with a 3-year extension. So my 10 years are up. I can't believe it. It's just a blink of an eye and it's
Mm.
gone.
And there's just so much, obviously, that we could explore further. But I suppose, just as you mentioned, that area of accountability and public
Mm.
scrutiny, it appears to me that, you know, your current role, more than any in the country, exposes you to that. What's your thoughts about being accountable to the public?
Well, I suppose as a public servant, I've always believed that I'm accountable to the public in any role I had, be it from being being a staff, being a student nurse, a staff nurse, all the way across. That you will always be accountable for what you do. I suppose here there is a greater sense of accountability, but we have an elected council, which is really important. It is, they are elected by the people for the people. So it is a great check and balance, I believe, to be able to have that scrutiny and to have it very public. Because all our council meetings are in public, but it is against a framework. Like it's not, we do every year have to have a corporate plan, an annual plan, so that's my accountability is against
Mm,
what we set out to deliver, if that makes sense.
yes.
But I mean, I think I haven't met a public servant in my career who doesn't value and see the importance of our public sector values, but also as part of that, our accountability.
Mm,
So we are responsible, we are accountable, and we have to have the authority to get on and do it. And those
mm.
three things to me fit very importantly together.
Just like you said, my experience of public servants is that actually public service is what drives them. I think often that gets lost.
Hmm.
And amongst the public servants quite often aren't valued for what they do and how they care for the citizen.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I suppose, look, we're very fortunate. We have security of employment. We enjoy very, reasonable terms and conditions in terms of leave and supports and all of that. But, what comes with that then is a really strong ethos and value system that drives how we deliver public service. But I think you're right. It's, sometimes you look at stuff on social media and it really hurts. It does, when, oh, the CEO is useless. She doesn't have a clue. Well, nobody knows everything about everything,
Mm,
because if they did, well, I don't know what you'd call them. But anyway, like we provide 1,100 services. I mean, I don't think there's anyone in the organisation who knows everything about everything. But I mean, it is about providing a leadership to the teams to deliver on those services, and having the bandwidth and the breadth of critique to be able to understand when things are going well and when things aren't going well, and being
mm,
honest about that. But sometimes that's kind of seen as weakness rather than strength.
mm,
But social media has changed public service, I think. It's the anonymity behind, the nastiness, but also this belief that you can say what you like about anybody. I
mm,
just find, even just from a human perspective, because behind everybody is a human being who
yeah.
has family and,
That's been lovely in this conversation, to understand some of the vulnerabilities, particularly that time when you were 40 and pregnant and holding a very responsible leadership
mm,
role. But, I suppose for us all really to understand that people um, are people at the end of, no matter what the role is, and no
yeah.
matter sometimes what the facade is, that underneath that there is a vulnerable individual.
We've had a psychologist work with us during COVID, because I just had a very strong belief that none of us had lived through a pandemic. We've done loads of pandemic preparedness, but living through one is kind of different. But she had a gorgeous saying, and I'm not sure I can mention her name, but I want to attribute the saying to her. She said, "Can we just all be sound?" Now it's a very Cork thing, be sound, but it really resonates, I
Yeah.
think, because there's no need to be nasty to each other as human beings. We can
Mm,
have differences of opinion. We can not agree on everything. That's really healthy and we need it. But we don't need to be nasty, because that's actually not achieving anything for anybody, is
mm,
it? And
no.
so, yeah, so be sound. And she has a gorgeous Cork accent when she says it. But it was during COVID, and that be sound is about just understand, try and meet people where they're at. Don't try and judge everybody, isn't it? Just be sound to each
Mm,
other.
it's lovely. That's lovely. Just to finish, Anne, you mentioned earlier that you might, or we might, touch on the subject of management and leadership and the difference between those
Mm.
two. Is there something that you want to leave us with around what the difference is from your point of view?
Yeah, I suppose it's interesting. I would say that what I have, my job now is a leadership job. So it's actually not about, when I was a ward sister, I had to maybe manage the ward, manage the people in a very different way, say, to what I do now. So I see that the leadership role is, and there are some similarities absolutely across management and leadership, but leadership has to be about trusting and believing in the people that you have around you to do what they're setting out to do, but also being out there, gathering the intelligence. So there's probably more of an external facing to this part of the leadership cycle than there would have been maybe in some of the more operational management, if I call them operational management
Mm,
jobs. So I think it's that, being able to do a lot of that horizon scanning. If you're used to being a very busy person in a management capacity, I think it's actually you have to stand back and say, what's the difference now that I'm in this leadership role?
mm,
Yeah. And it is probably more external facing in terms of horizon scanning and getting, more stakeholder involvement and bringing that back into your organization, but also taking the goodness of what your organization does out with you. Does that make
mm, mm.
some sense? Yeah. And
Yes,
that's a
absolutely.
big change. Like most of us who come up through a system, any system, like are very used to the doing. Yeah.
Right. That's right.
The things, doing things.
Yes.
Whereas I think in the leadership piece, you actually have to be able to stand back a piece and let
Mm,
lots of people
mm.
do the doing, but actually be able to keep that, bringing newness and freshness and innovation constantly into it.
Yeah, really understanding the environment in which you're operating as well,
Mm,
and
mm.
and all of those interlinkages. You
Yeah,
talked about working cross departmentally earlier, and the
mm,
importance of that. And yeah, I
yeah.
really hear that in what you're saying. And uh, there's just a wealth of obviously experience, knowledge, learning, and so not all of it easy,
Mm,
I suspect,
mm.
that you've garnered over the years. Is there anything in particular that you would want to say to young women now who are maybe starting out in their careers, maybe starting in their career in a civil service role? What
Mm.
advice would you love to offer?
Unfortunately, I suppose it's changing in the sense that there's a far more openness to being different, to innovation, to having ideas about how to change things than maybe than back when I was starting out. I mean, it's all about how you approach it. You can bring your newness and your freshness to anything, but I suppose it's back to understanding and meeting people where they're at
Mm,
is really, really important. I think the world's the oyster for any young lady starting out now. A lot of the barriers have been knocked, thanks be to God, and there are still some there.
mm,
But I suppose it is, that be sound bit probably applies. Be
mm,
sound to each other, because sometimes I think
yeah.
women are not always sound to each other, and that's a pity. And I don't know why,
Mm,
because we go, yeah, it's just an interesting one.
mm,
But I just think, go for it. Be yourself always and be truthful to yourself. And
mm.
if it doesn't fit, well, don't try and wear it.
And the very last thing, when you did go through that vulnerable time, and I'm sure there was more than one, but let's say
Hmm.
the more recent one, what helped and supported you to come through that?
I had good colleagues, so if you're, really, really good colleagues, obviously family, and being honest about it, I think is important.
Mm.
I suppose I had a great prize at the end of my vulnerability. She came out, about that size.
Yeah.
And, but yeah, yeah. And I suppose that's the piece, as women, You know, we go through a cycle of having babies. I think, thank God, now we're talking about menopause, and you know, that whole challenge that women go through that we were never allowed to talk about, which I think is a vulnerability again that
Mm,
women practitioners, if I use that word, have to pretend doesn't exist. You
mm.
know, now I would constantly be on about my flushing and it's too hot and too cold, and but you know that's all right.
Mm.
But
Yes.
yeah, but at least we're having those conversations,
Yeah.
yeah, about vulnerability, be it in pregnancy or in menopause or in other aspects of life. You know, people have lots of care commitments,
Mm.
etc. That do, you know, we do need to think about, and that's back to meeting people where they're at. But look,
Yeah.
isn't workplace more flexible now as well? You know,
Yes.
that I mean, COVID was traumatic, but look what the opportunities it brought.
Yeah.
Did we think we'd be doing this interview like
A-
this?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes. You and Cork and me and Sligo.
yeah.
Um,
You know,
and it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, as I knew it would be. But I suppose what for me I'm taking away is about be yourself and be sound.
be
Um,
sound. Well, as I said, I've robbed that from a gorgeous lady.
mm,
Her name is Jennifer. She'll know who she is. And I just thought that was kind of game changing for me.
mm,
Just, you know, just be sound. There's no
mm.
harm in being sound to each other.
Thank you, Anne.
Thanks, Lily.
And whatever the next step might be for you when your 10-year contract is up, I wish you the very best of luck with it.
Thank you very much.
If you've enjoyed today's show, do like and share the podcast. If you'd like to hear more interviews with smart, ambitious, passionate women in the public service, you can listen to us wherever you get your podcasts. We welcome positive feedback and suggestions for future guests you'd like to hear from. Meantime, goodbye from me, Lily Murphy, and all the team at Her Next Step. Remember to look for the stepping stone that will support your next step, or consider how you could be the stepping stone for somebody else.